Hello and welcome to Business Standard. Here's a glimpse of the views expressed on the web pages of Business Standard this week. Whether one likes it or not, Indian banking is headed the way of telecom and aviation, writes TN Nainen in his weekly column for Business Standard. India's private banks are pulling ahead of their government-owned counterparts with better net interest margins, lower costs and steady profitability, he writes. The situation is likely to worsen for public sector banks after the pandemic-related moratorium and other shock absorbers are taken away. Although the government has tried many things like recapitalization, a bank's board bureau to select the best CEOs, merger of weak banks with stronger ones, Indian public sector banking appears to be headed the way of its counterparts in telecom and aviation, and privatization appears to be the only feasible solution, Nainen writes. In his column in the Business Standard this week, Shekhar Gupta writes about late Pranab Mukherjee's changing mood and reserve with truth-telling in the fourth volume of his memoir, The Presidential Years. Gupta writes that despite being a man of strong views and conviction, Mukherjee comes across as a person who shows hesitation with truth-telling. Gupta says this could be because of two reasons. Either this posthumously published volume was too close to the years he's talking about, or he took an overly self-restraining view of what he could leave for posterity of his time in Rashtrapati Bhavan as a non-party person. Although Mukherjee has written about his clash with the Gandhi family in his memoirs, for some reason he has not mentioned the winner of this clash. While he won the presidency, he did not get the prime ministership, the prize he really wanted. Gupta feels that by reading all the four volumes, one might determine if in his own eyes he was a winner or a loser. In his weekly column for Business Standard, Mahesh Vyas lists the factors that drove the unemployment rate to 9.1% in December. This is the highest unemployment rate since the beginning of India's recovery in June after the lockdown, Vyas writes. The main problem in December was the failure of the farm sector to absorb the influx of labor. Farming is the last resort of many who are out of work, but December is not the month in which it can absorb labor. This is the month when it sheds jobs, Vyas writes. While the farm sector shedding labor was a big reason for the fall in employment, the worsening labor market conditions were seen across the urban and rural areas. This across-the-board worsening raises concerns about the recovery process, Vyas concludes. Prosenjit Datta takes a look at techno-nationalism in a column for Business Standard. He writes, "We're in the middle of a tech race for supremacy between the older developed nations with the US at the helm on one side and China on the other. The goal is dominance over new technologies such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, and so on that will shape the future. The world is getting divided into original innovators and the dependents. Till recently, India was open to technology coming from both the old developed nations as well as China. After rising tensions with China, it is talked about self-sufficiency. The issue is that successive governments have failed to articulate and execute a coherent long-term vision. India can develop cutting-edge technology but has shown little ambition to compete with other countries. That attitude needs to change. Just a high GDP will not give India a seat at the high table of technology," Datta writes. TCA Srinivasa Raghavan makes a few predictions on how the deadlock between the farmers and central government will likely break. For this, he uses game theory methods called minimax and maximin. One tries to minimize the maximum loss while making decisions, and the other tries to maximize the minimum gain. Applying these methods, he predicts the farmers will likely drop the demand for a legislated price in return for a written assurance that MSP will not be abolished. The government should not have any objection as it never intended to abolish MSP. The government may also extend MSP to some other minor crops and also guarantee an income for a few years to compensate Punjab and Haryana farmers while they switch from paddy to other crops. If this happens, we will have reached a mutually acceptable solution of minimax and maximin, Srinivasa Raghavan concludes. Looking at the centre's first advance estimates that the real GDP in India will contract by 7.7% in fiscal year 2021, Business Standard in an editorial says a 2021 that is dominated by a slow return to normal growth momentum is the best case scenario. Science suggests that the economy will be able to return to normal on its own as long as liquidity and credit remain available. In past crises, the mistake has been to overstimulate the economy. The Finance Ministry must identify those sectors that most need bridging support over the course of the next financial year and ensure that all packages are time-bound and limited in scope. And the RBI will have to clearly communicate its exit from excessively accommodative monetary policy over the course of its next few statements. As the estimates show, fiscal year 2021 has been a lost year, but it must be ensured that this crisis does not leave a long shadow, the editorial says. Dictators and democrats around the world would have been aware that they were seeing the irreversible decline of the US as a superpower as armed mobs rampaged through the US Capitol, Business Standard writes in an editorial. Visuals of Trump supporters clashing with congressional security forces and the National Guard and trashing congressional offices have weakened the institutional authority of the US presidency, the editorial says. This comes at a time when global leadership is sorely needed for issues such as climate change, terrorism, and pandemics. Wednesday's events will be deeply discouraging for America's allies, even as Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping may be energized to expand their global authoritarian footprints. After this, the lasting contribution of Donald Trump's presidency is to have made America weak again, the editorial says. Examining the state of the public sector banks ahead of the annual budget, Business Standard writes in an editorial that pumping in capital year after year has not yielded the desired results. The government is considering the idea of a bank investment company or BIC in the budget, and this is a step in the right direction, the editorial says. The BIC can hold the equity stake held by the government and have the autonomy to set the goals in terms of financial returns from banks that it will control. This would free public sector banks from government control and allow them to operate more professionally. It would also help boost valuations and enable public sector banks to raise capital from the market. The BIC might also be a better option at this stage because it will be difficult to privatize public sector banks and the government cannot keep infusing capital perpetually, the editorial says. Serious questions have been raised about the transparency and credibility of the drug regulators' process for approving COVID-19 vaccines manufactured by Serum Institute of India and Bharat Biotech, Business Standard writes in an editorial. It's critical for the government to address these doubts in a transparent and upfront manner instead of leaving the public to rely on random statements from different players in the system, the editorial says. India's approval process is in sharp contrast to the US FDA, which live-streamed the review and issued a detailed memo on the vaccine. In the UK, a press conference involved answering detailed questions. India does not even make public the names of the members of the Subject Expert Committee or the National Expert Group on COVID-19 administration. Such secrecy is likely to lead to widespread mistrust in the vaccine, the editorial says. In an editorial, Business Standard underlines the need to take the GST collection data for December with a pinch of salt. GST collection reached a record 1.15 trillion rupees in December, witnessing a growth rate of 11.6% over the same period last year. The increase is being seen as a sign of strong economic recovery, but the data should be treated with caution, the editorial says. There are several other reasons for higher GST collection. For instance, tax collection may be reflecting the festive demand, which may not sustain in the coming months. Further, the government has taken several steps to strengthen the GST system, which may have resulted in higher collection. In any case, it's important not to get carried away by the year-on-year comparison. The data on economic activity will show a sharp rebound in the coming months, particularly from April, and should be carefully interpreted, the editorial says.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.